Welcome to our course on the history of Mesopotamia from about 5000 BC to the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. We will begin our study of the ancient history of Iraq by considering a 21st century event. In April 2003, news outlets informed the world of the devastating looting that occurred in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad in the wake of the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. These images of broken cases and empty galleries reminded us of the rich heritage of the world's oldest civilization and the artifacts that represented it. Over the next several months, it was reported that about 14,000 objects were missing or destroyed. Law agencies throughout the world were notified. An Interpol list was created and distributed to customs agencies around the world. It emerged that many of the objects had been hidden by the staff of the museum. Some were returned immediately and had been taken by citizens who were concerned for the safety of the objects. Others were returned under an amnesty agreement, and many were captured in customs raids around the world. By 2004, about a year after the looting of the museum, 600 objects from the Iraq Museum had been retrieved by U.S. customs authorities, another 400 by Italian officials, and 1,000 or so were recovered in Jordan. As of 2006, it is estimated that about half of the objects are still missing, and the majority of these are small portable tablets and cylinder seals, of which about 5,000 were taken from the museum. The destruction of the past was not limited to the Iraq Museum. Widespread looting of archaeological sites was also reported at the same time. The losses in this area will take much longer to evaluate, but they are even more damaging to future research, as the sites themselves are severely, irreparably damaged by looters' pits. Two examples of looted sites that we will be discussing in the early part of this course occurred at Nippur, the religious capital of Mesopotamia, which suffered from extensive looting, and the site of Isin, which shows hundreds of random pits dug by looters who extracted cuneiform tablets and offerings to the goddess of love and war, Ishtar. These are vivid examples of how antiquity continues to play a role in the modern world. And it's certainly not an isolated event. When the Bamiyan Buddhas were destroyed by the Taliban in Afghanistan, there was widespread outcry at the loss to cultural heritage. But what is most distressing about this particular case is the scale, which scholars around the world claim is unprecedented. Today, I'm going to use some of the most famous objects from the Iraq Museum to set out the legacy of ancient Mesopotamia and to describe certain aspects of this culture that we will explore in the course. Some of the essential features of Mesopotamia and its advanced civilization are the development of agriculture, the earliest cities, the introduction of writing, codified law, monumental architecture, which we see represented by temples, palaces, and city walls. All of these are aspects of society that we use every day, but first occurred 7,000 years ago in Iraq. The borders of the modern nation of Iraq have had many names, such as the Fertile Crescent, which refers to its position as part of the origin of agriculture, or Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers in Greek. This term was first applied by the Romans when they controlled the province, and rivers are indeed vital to the development of the earliest cities around 5000 BC. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers water the area, which is bordered to the west by the Arabian Desert, the Zagros Mountains to the east, and the Taurus Mountains to the north. The specific geography and environment of the region spurred large-scale agriculture and promoted cities. Cities will be a theme of the course that allows us to look at the increasing complexity of the region and how it changes over the long period that we will discuss. We will see that an urban lifestyle supports a number of different professions. Craftsmen and artisans created the necessities of life: houses, tools, pottery for food storage and preparation. Traders supplied goods produced outside of the city, including necessities, again, such as food, or more exotic luxuries, such as lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, used for jewelry. Priests at a temple would fulfill the religious needs of a community, and on a more mundane level, weavers, often women, made clothing, and launderers washed it. Most important for us, scribes created records of these and other aspects of Mesopotamian life and politics. Archaeological evidence of all of these aspects of city life will be essential as we study the history of Mesopotamia throughout the course. As the idea of the city evolved and spread, it required certain forms of technology to sustain it. In Mesopotamia, a critical feature of the city was irrigation canals to water the farms and the agricultural fields that surrounded and fed the city. These canals were not ditches dug by one or even a few individuals, but by many people. Communal labor and cooperation on this scale required some form of organization. So by looking at the irrigation canals that created the agriculture supporting the cities, we can begin to discuss the social organization within these cities. In Mesopotamian thought, cities were founded and protected by the gods, and it is not surprising that the earliest monumental structures created in cities were temples. These too were civic projects in which most of, if not all of the population, joined together to build the home of the god. Temples were a central feature of every city. They were restored and expanded by rulers. They were visited by worshippers and by tourists. We will see that the role of religion played an important part in the social order of the city and of Mesopotamian life in general. One of the masterpieces of the Iraq Museum was the Uruk Vase, a 3-foot-tall alabaster vase dating to the 4th millennium BC. On the vase, we see 4 registers or rows carved with figures that represent the social hierarchy. In fact, the community as a whole can be seen to be represented on the Uruk Vase. The lowest register shows a river flowing around the bottom of the vase, which reminds us of the importance of rivers to Mesopotamian culture. In fact, the river provides the resources necessary for all of the images that we see above on the Uruk Vase. In the second register from the bottom, we see a procession of domesticated animals, sheep and goats, which were the economic base of Mesopotamian culture. They were important not for meat, but for the wool and hair that they provided, which could be woven into textiles. In future centuries, we will learn that cloth production was a major commodity in the economy of the region. The top 2 registers show human figures engaged in 2 activities that will occupy much of our attention in the next few lectures. In the third register, a row of nude male figures carry baskets and jars of food that they have presumably cultivated and harvested. One of the reasons that civilization appeared so early in Mesopotamia is the amazing fertility of the land in this region. The purpose of the gifts of food is seen in the top register, where there are more offerings brought to a female figure, probably the patron goddess of Uruk, Inanna. In addition, there is one clothed male figure wearing a long skirt. This part of the vase was damaged long ago, and it shows either a priest or a ruler who oversees the presentation of the gifts to the goddess. We begin to understand some of the essential elements of the early civilization in Mesopotamia by examining this vase. And this helps explain why it was thought to be one of the major losses after the museum was damaged. The Uruk Vase has been recovered in pieces and is currently undergoing conservation before it is put on display again. The political control of and rule over cities is another critical aspect of urbanization and complex society in general, and we will spend quite a bit of time analyzing the changing role and representation of rulers in both texts and art. We will look at texts that compare kings to shepherds who protect, or strong warriors who defend, and judges who ensure justice for all of their people. This last quality of a ruler, his sense of justice, does not mean that he distributed equal treatment for the rich and the poor, but rather that he gave them fair treatment according to their status. The poor man receives less compensation for a robbery than a wealthy man, but he does receive some recompense under this understanding of law. Sargon of Akkad, who ruled from 2334 to 2279 BC, exemplifies a strong and successful ruler. A life-size copper head, either showing Sargon or one of his immediate successors, was displayed in the Iraq Museum. Sargon's legendary military exploits were remembered long after his rule, as later rulers tried to replicate his achievements. Sargon was the first king to unite northern and southern Mesopotamia. The image shows a mature man with a long beard that covers most of his face and splits at the bottom. The curly texture of the beard contrasts with the figure's smooth face. The ruler also has long hair, which is pulled back into a chignon and bound with a wide fillet or band, which is his only visible symbol of kingship. What is most memorable about his head are the eyes, which were originally inlaid with stone and shell that would give them a very lifelike appearance. The eyes were missing when the head was discovered and were probably gouged out in antiquity, perhaps even taken by some soldier ravaging a city who wanted to inflict more damage on the statue of the king. This ruler's image represents some of the horrors of warfare that Mesopotamian rulers conducted with regularity, and this too will be a topic that we will consider throughout the course. This iconic image of a strong ruler was one of the top 30 pieces placed on the Interpol list of objects missing from the Iraq Museum, before it was learned that members of the Department of Antiquities had hidden it in the National Bank of Iraq. It has since been recovered. We've seen in both the Uruk Vase and in the Akkadian head that artistic creativity was displayed in Mesopotamia. Now let's turn to a more intellectual achievement in another example of an artifact from the Iraq Museum. One of the most important developments in Mesopotamia was the invention of writing in the late 4th millennium BC. Once it was created, writing was employed in many ways. We will find receipts of transactions, both large and small. The writing was used as a tool for rulers to conduct diplomacy with other kings, to govern provinces, or to issue orders to their army. Kings will also set down laws for their state in written form in the earliest law codes. On a more personal level, writing recorded the powerful emotion of love poems, prayers, and even magic spells to help prevent illness. These texts are preserved not on paper, but on palm-sized clay tablets, which was the main writing surface of the region. Because the texts were written on clay, which is not perishable, these texts are preserved when they're baked or hardened or even just dried out, and archaeologists recover from them evidence for politics, religion, economy, science, and culture. These tablets preserve a wide range of information about daily life, royal activities, and the interpretation of what these texts convey will be the focus of much of this course. For example, it may seem that economic texts are relatively straightforward. But we may not know if the industry is overseen by a temple, the palace, or one or more individuals. So if we think of a specific case, say a text reports a large flock of several hundred sheep and goats. Is this tribute sent to a king? Was it owned by a temple that used the wool for textile production? Did this large flock belong to a wealthy family? All of these distinctions make a difference in how we interpret the text. In another example of the challenges that are presented by the interpretation of these texts, official documents, which are our most abundant source of evidence for the history of the era, rarely describe a ruler or a city losing a war. Not everyone can win all the time, so we have to piece together the reality of the situation from other evidence. Kings will often claim to devastate a rebelling city and tear down its walls, giving the impression that they've completely obliterated the revolt. And yet, the next year they have to go back and do the very same thing again. From this, we understand that they really have not stamped out the revolt. So even though the king always wins in the texts, we realize that sometimes he wins more decisively than others. Letters, both private and royal, survive for us in these cuneiform texts, and these would seem to be enormously helpful in understanding a specific period or subject. Imagine how exciting it would be to find a letter from a husband to a wife, or from one king to another king, and we can fill in some aspects of history from these personal documents. But these texts may not include a date, or they may use names that we don't recognize, so it becomes difficult to interpret their meaning fully. We might get other information from objects found with the text that can help us understand this a little bit better. If letters are found in what is clearly a private house, then we would interpret them much differently than if they were found in the archive of a palace. We will see examples of both of these in the course. The written sources reveal a fundamental cultural continuity throughout the period that we will study. And this cohesion is demonstrated by the worship of the same gods and heroes, and the recounting of the same stories and myths that record their exploits. Although records will also document almost constant warfare and shifting political alliances, these events had little effect on the lives of most farmers or even city dwellers. It's going to be very easy to forget as we focus on the deeds of kings and the broader political perspective that the majority of people who lived in Mesopotamia were focused on sustaining and improving their lives, rather than the deeds of a king, even a great king like Sargon of Akkad. About 5,000 cuneiform texts have been lost from the Iraq Museum, and they are being taken from the sites that are currently being looted. These texts will be especially difficult to recover because they are so desirable on the antiquities market and because they are small and easy to transport. As we discuss the wealth of evidence that we can derive from these texts, you will see that the loss of this evidence is especially severe. Looking on a larger scale, rulers who built the most impressive monuments, especially the kings who created and governed the great empires of the first millennium BC, will be an important theme of the latter part of our course. The Assyrians dominate in the early part of this era, and they created an empire that stretched from Iran to the eastern Mediterranean in Syria. For a few years, they even controlled part of Egypt. The Assyrians celebrated their success in huge stone palaces decorated with stone relief sculpture. The most popular images found in these sculptures depicted the rulers as military men who were able to hunt animals and humans with equal success and equal enthusiasm. We can get a taste for this when we turn to a small ivory plaque that probably decorated a chair or some other type of furniture, of the Assyrian palace at Nimrud. This exotic material, ivory, gives us first a glimpse into the true luxury of the royal household. The plaque shows a lioness attacking an African youth, probably along the banks of the Nile River, since papyrus reeds wave in the background. The plaque was gilded and inlaid with lapis lazuli and carnelian. It is one of a pair. The other is in the British Museum, and this has been missing since the Iraq Museum was looted in 2003. The Assyrian king, even more than other rulers, was shown as the leader of the army. He was the man who inflicted the most terror, the most violence. And the idea behind these images appears in both texts and in the art of the palaces. The concept that the Assyrians were trying to convey was to frighten their opponents into submitting before a battle was necessary. We will think about the ideology found in these images in more detail when we get to the Assyrian Empire. One of the most common images that we will find at the Assyrian palaces is a half-human, half-bull creature called a lamassu. These protected the doorways to palaces and the major entrances of public buildings. And they showed that the king was protected by the gods. He had a divine force that both justified his rule and protected it. The Assyrians, as they described their campaigns, were very interested in portraying specific historical events, and this is true in both their art and in their texts. On the art of the palaces, we can identify individual ethnic groups as well as historical campaigns. The palaces showed what this particular king did in this particular year and which enemies he was able to defeat, and with what great success. In the second half of the first millennium, we'll trace the rise of the Persians, who are an Iranian ethnic group that took over and even expanded the Assyrian Empire. The Persians are probably the best-known Mesopotamian empire because they crossed into Europe in the 5th century BC to attack Greece. They were ultimately unsuccessful, but Greek historians documented these invasions, and they're surprising. In fact, no one was probably more surprised than the Greeks. Their surprising victory over such a powerful empire. Along the way, the Greeks created many of the ideas, both factual and fictional, which persist today about Mesopotamia and the Near East. We will also derive some of these ideas from the Old Testament. Both of these lands, Greece and the Syria-Palestine coast, were the focus of Assyrian and Persian incursions. The Persians adopted imagery that had long been used in Mesopotamia, partly as a way to legitimize their own rule. One reason the Persians chose to incorporate old-fashioned styles into their art was to show that these new rulers from a foreign land had appropriated the same ideals that had served earlier leaders. As a foreign power, the Persians were eager to prove that they had a legitimate claim to govern. By presenting themselves as the next generation in a long line of Mesopotamian rulers, they could help to create ties to the local culture. The Persian governance of its empire is displayed in its art and gives us a sense of what made them distinct. Rather than showing the complete dominance over another group, as the Assyrians enjoyed doing, the Persians preferred to emphasize the benefits of their rule. And often they showed the different regions of their empire bringing tribute, the taxes that were demanded by the Persian king, in a peaceful way. With a shift in focus from war to a calm procession of happy members of the provinces bringing gifts to the king, their beloved king, this gives Persian art a much more timeless perpetual feeling than we see with the Assyrians. So already we see a contrast in the different cultures that we'll be exploring. The Assyrians want to record individual events that really happened. The Persians want to record an idea of what their rule brings to the people they govern. The final empire that we will explore is that created by Alexander the Great. Alexander crossed from Greece into Asia in the late 4th century, claiming revenge for the Persian attacks on Greece. Alexander's well-trained army and his own strategic brilliance combined to defeat the Persians and their last king, Darius III, and this brought Alexander both enormous power and unimaginable wealth. He would begin to adopt Persian customs as a way to effectively govern this new territory. And it's somewhat ironic that as a Greek invader taking up the rule of the Persian Empire, they themselves, the Persians themselves, were invaders in Mesopotamia. So we see we'll see as we end with Alexander, the many layers of cultures that we will come to understand in this course. As East and West meet, West will bow to the East with its imagery. A silver coin from the Iraq Museum, stamped with the image of Alexander the Great, may have paid a mercenary soldier from a later ruler who tried to recreate Alexander's empire. No king did this successfully or for very long. On the reverse of the coin is the Greek god Zeus, who is seated on his throne. These images, brought from Greece and carried as far east as India, illustrate the interaction between East and West after Alexander's rule. Material objects of the type belonging to the Iraq Museum were found in excavations in Iraq and in neighboring countries. We will return frequently to archaeology in order to learn about the history and culture of this region. Artifacts such as this were used by people thousands of years ago in their temples, in their homes, sometimes even in their burials. And as we create our history of Mesopotamia, it can seem as if we have a very clear view and understanding of what life was like in ancient Mesopotamia. In fact, these artifacts only hint at the very full and rich civilization that was developed there. The looting of the Iraq Museum and archaeological sites in the country can also remind us of the widespread effects of war on cultures throughout human history. When a text from Babylon, for example, records the lament for the destruction of that city, we can keep in mind these objects from the Iraq Museum and others that we'll encounter, that as a way to help us imagine what culture has been lost. In this course, we will explore and study many firsts: the first cities, the first writing systems, the first epic poems, and the first empires. A study of these important ideas within their historical context, how the Mesopotamians understood them and used them, will allow us to gain insight into when and how they emerged and changed over the millennia, and how we employ them today. My name is Alexis Castor. I teach in the Department of Classics at Franklin and Marshall College, where I teach Greek, Roman, and Near Eastern history. My PhD is in Classical and Near Eastern Archaeology from Bryn Mawr College, and one of the ways I look at ancient history is to use artifacts as well as historical texts to understand how these two different types of evidence combine to teach us about the cultures that were lost millennia ago. In the next lecture, we will discuss the geography and the environment in Iraq. We will look at a combination of factors that were important in the rise of cities and the development of this very rich civilization in the land between the rivers.